In review, today's lesson will be entitled, Don't Follow Those Who Do Bad, but Those Who Do Good. Before we get to that, in verses, which it will be the final several verses, verses 9 through 14, before we get to that, we're going to do a review on last week's lesson, helping those who are sharing the gospel, verses 5 through 8. In verse 5 in the Good News Bible, it said, My dear friend, you are so faithful in the work you do for other Christians, even when they are strangers. And David Guzik had a comment. He's a commentator and a current pastor in, I believe, Texas. But he had a comment, in that day Christian travelers in general, in traveling ministers, itinerant. I couldn't quite think what that word was, but it's traveling ministers in particular were greatly dependent upon the hospitality of other Christians. John knew that when Christians assist those who counted for the truth, they became fellow workers for the truth. That's what, in other words, they reap some of the rewards. Like you give to missionaries and they win people to Christ, you get some of that reward because you supported them. I had a note there, as for Christians fleeing their homes because of persecution, People's New Testament notes, for brevity, I had them in my last week's notes, but when I do review, I have to cut a lot of those notes out to make room for this week's notes. But People's New Testament brought out in that some of the Christians that depended on hospitality in those days were Christians who were fleeing persecution. They had to get up and get out of town because they were in Jerusalem or whatever other city was under persecution at that moment, and they had to hit the road running. And so they counted on the hospitality of Christians in the towns they would go to put them up until they could get on their feet. But it seems from the context that the main group John is referring to are the traveling preachers. When a well-respected preacher comes through town, in those days, they didn't make a lot of money. They didn't go and stay in a fancy inn somewhere. They usually found, matter of fact, when Jesus sent his disciples out 2 by 2, he told them, when you go into town, find someone that'll put you up and receive their hospitality and eat what's set before you, etc. So I put a note there. As for Christians fleeing because of persecution, in America, we're not quite there yet, but we're closer than we have ever been to Christian persecution in America. When I was a teenager in the Baptist church, when Barb and I were young traveling preachers, in the late 60s, throughout the 70s, well, in the 70s, somewhere there, we started doing some pastoring, and traveling became less and less. But in those days, if you'd have told us there was going to come a time in our lifetime in America where Christians were at risk for persecution, I would have told you you're crazy. But we are at risk now. There's people who don't like the Christian church, the evangelicals, those who believe the Bible means what it says, because we won't submit to the doctrine of wokeness. We believe the Bible has the final say, not people. And that puts us at risk. If not after the coming election, then after the next one, or after the one after, but it's very, very close. Christians are going to be persecuted. Already in California, they're threatening there are preachers in big churches, big congregations, we might even call them mega churches, that refuse to shut down church during the pandemic. And they are being threatened with jail. So they don't shut the riots down anywhere in San Francisco or anything, but they shut the churches down. And some of these mega pastors said, fool you with you, we're having church. That's our constitutional right and we're going to have it. And one guy was being interviewed by one of the radio political talking heads, I think it was, I could have seen him on TV, but I think it was the radio. And there was a rumor that he was going to be arrested that day. And so the host asked him about that, and he said, well, I heard the rumor, and so we were kind of pacing, not knowing what's going to happen. But he said, I'll tell you this, if they had arrested me, I'd have posted bail. If you got a mega church, you can do that. If they arrested me, I'd probably sit there a while. But anyway, if they arrested, he said, I would have posted bail, and because of the COVID issues have tied up the courts, and it would be after the election before my trial would ever happen. But he refused to move a budge. We have a constitutional right to have church. They keep bars open, they keep abortion clinics open, and they were telling churches they couldn't have church. And in some areas where they said you can have church, you can't sing. No singing. Because they say when you sing, you're going to be spreading your germs all over the place. So it's a crazy world. We're getting closer and closer. They're coming to get us. That's the bad news. Here's the good news. Someone else is coming to get us. And someday he will descend with a shout. The dead in Christ will rise first. Then you and I are going home. So that's the good news. All right, so that's what we talked about there. And then verses 7 and 8 is telling why these traveling preachers needed the help of people. It's because if they refused to take money from the Gentiles, the non-Jews. And we covered some of that. I'm not going to go over that last week. I'm not going to go over that again this week because I want to get into this, the final lesson of 3 John. This week's lesson is don't follow those who do bad, but those who do good. He says in verse 9, John writing this letter, he said, I wrote unto the church. We don't know what the church was. We don't know exactly where it was. You know, like Paul wrote to the church in Rome, the churches in Galatia, the church in Ephesus. John doesn't identify where this church is, but he said, I wrote unto the church, but then he brings up a member in that church that has a lot of authority. He says, Diotrephes, who loveth to have the preeminence among them, receiveth us not. The Good News Bible put it this way. John wrote, I wrote a short letter to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to be their leader, will not pay any attention to what I say. Cambridge commentary said this, that any Christian should be found to act in this manner towards the last surviving apostle is nothing less than astounding. Now, there is some discrepancy among commentators when John wrote some of his letters, but the majority of them believe that this was in the last decade of the first century and John was in his 90s. All the other apostles that followed Jesus, the 12 apostles, were dead. Paul, an apostle born out of due season, dead. Of all those who wrote Scripture, only John remains. Of all those who followed and sat at the feet of Jesus listening to him teach, only John remains. And there is a church leader in the church that John is writing to that feels threatened by this guy because he wants all the attention and all the authority. So he refuses to acknowledge John's letter. He refuses to give any information or any invitation or permission for John to come and address the congregation. I tell you, if John were 2090 and living today, he could speak here anytime he wants. And we'd all sit here with our jaws hanging down. For two reasons. Because that's the guy who followed Jesus. And the second reason, how's he still alive? And if he's over 2,000 years old, why is he not running for president? But anyway, that's just another story. So, he said that in verse 9, then down in verse 10. Well, I put here, what sad truth do we learn from verse 9? Some so-called Christian leaders are more interested in maintaining the authority they have seized than they are in their people hearing the truth of the Scriptures. So verse 10, Wherefore, John writing now, Wherefore, if I come, I will remember his deeds which he doeth, prating against us with malicious words, and not content therewith, neither does he himself receive the brethren, the ones he's telling the church they ought to take care of, and forbiddeth them that would, and casteth them out of the church. So this guy doesn't want people listening to other preachers, so he doesn't want any of them putting up a preacher in their house, which is what the first part, which is what the lesson last week was about. Don't take care of them, and if you do, I'm kicking you out of the church. So that's the kind of scoundrel that John is talking about. Now, the Good News Bible, I read verse 10 in the King James on page 13. I'll flip over to page 14. Here's that same verse in the Good News Bible. John saying, When I come then, I will bring up everything he has done, the terrible things he says about us, and the lies he tells. But that is not enough for him. He will not receive the Christians when they come, and even stops those who want to receive them, and tries to drive them out of the church. So this Diotrephes was not a nice guy, and somehow he had wrestled authority from whoever had it before him in the local church and was ruling it with an iron fist. So what do we learn here? John was an apostle, perhaps the last one living, and the only reason I put perhaps there is there are a handful of commentators who believe it was written in the 60s. Paul might have been alive at that time. But again, the majority believe he was 90 years old when he was writing these letters, and that would have put him somewhere in the last decade of the first century A.D. So, in all likelihood, he was the last living apostle, and as such, he had the authority of an apostle. In God's church, who do you suppose God will support in a showdown between John and Diotrephes? I'd have my money on John. Now, why wasn't John at least a little bit intimidated by Diotrephes? This man wielded power, drove people from the church who didn't agree with him, and John had no fear whatsoever of this guy. He said, if I come, I'm going to confront him. What gave John that kind of boldness? Well, consider this. Tradition tells us. In other words, when I say tradition, these are not things that were written down. These are things that were shared from generation to generation in the early church. People would talk about this and to their kids, and their kids would talk about it to their kids, etc. And that's called tradition. And a lot of things that you will read in commentaries and stuff are based on tradition. For example, we don't know for certain that Peter was crucified upside down. Tradition tells us that it was handed down and until it became part of what many consider the truth of the history of the believers. Others might say became a part of folklore. But nonetheless, history tells us, tradition tells us that John had already been boiled in oil. All the apostles, except John, died of martyrdom. They were killed because of their faith. If this tradition that was handed down is true, a certain emperor of Rome tried to kill John. They lit the fire under a barrel of oil and put him in it. And so the oil is bubbling. Not a fun way to die, I would imagine. I have never tried it, but I would imagine it was not fun. The Caesar at that time was, it's really, I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce it. It looks like Domitian. Probably Domitian, I don't know. Some of those names I'm not sure. It all depends on where you part the syllables there. But the reason he has the word Caesar in front of him, remember when Julius Caesar became the first emperor of Rome, after a while Caesar became a title for all of his successors, like king. Over in England we got Queen Elizabeth. So instead of saying they were kings, they used the word Caesar. And so this Caesar had the authority to do what he wanted up to some extent. I'll explain in a moment. So he said, throw John in the boiling oil. John had that kind of miracle that was not totally unique. If you remember in the Old Testament, there were these three guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They weren't thrown in boiling oil. They were thrown in a fiery furnace. And an angel came and walked in the fire with them. That's my take on it. It said they threw in three. The king saw four in there, and one was like the Son of God. But when you read in the Old Testament, the Son of God usually means angels, until the New Testament come along and the Son of God meant something else. So when it talks about the Son of God in the Old Testament, it's almost always talking about angels. So some like the excitement of thinking it might have been the pre-incarnate Christ. Whatever lights your fire, no pun intended. If you want to think it's Jesus, I got no problem with that. Go ahead and think it. But anyway, a heavenly visitor went in that furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The men who threw them in the fire was so hot they died just from being exposed to the heat coming from it. Them guys are just walking around in there with their heavenly gas. And finally, they put the fire out and get them out of there, and they don't even have a burn on them. So the similarity between that story and what tradition tells us about John, if you're being boiled in oil, your skin ought to be peeling off and eventually dying, and you're going to have skeleton when you're all done. They got tired of waiting. They just got him out of the boiling thing. He had no burns on him, nothing. He was doing just fine. The Senate, the Roman Senate, he wanted to have his soldiers stab him with swords, and they said, Caesar, Caesar, we got this problem, the Constitution, whatever they called their set of laws, says if you carry out the death sentence, you can't redo it. If he didn't have the decency to die, you're stuck with him. You can't reorder him to die. You've already carried out your sentence. So they banished John to the Isle of Patmos, which was a prison island. And many, I shouldn't say many, certainly some of the commentators, Chuck Swindoll being one of them, I believe. Now, Chuck just recently preached through 1 John on the radio. Some of them believe he didn't only write the book of Revelation on the Isle of Patmos, but he wrote his epistles as well, and the Gospel of John. Since he's telling people, I'm going to come see you here in a letter, I don't think he wrote that one from the Isle of Patmos. But I think he had already been released. But I bring this up because I want you to see this is a man who faced the anger of Caesar. Thrown in boiling oil, God rescued him. Threw him on the Isle of Patmos, God gave him the book of Revelation. And then he was supposed to die over there, and we don't have any idea how. But he was eventually released. Maybe another Caesar came in who was sympathetic, released him, and he was back here talking to Christians again. Now, do you think that guy who had been through that feared some local bully in a church? I don't think that local bully knew who he was dealing with. If you knew about a guy who had been boiled in oil and lived to talk about it without a scar, would you be picking a fight with that guy? I don't know. It just seems stupid to me. So, he was not intimidated by him at all. So he said in verse 11, and this is where I got the title. Again, the title is, Don't Follow Those Who Do Bad, but Those Who Do Good. Beloved, follow not that which is evil, but that which is good. He that doeth good is of God, but he that doeth evil has not seen God. He's not talking about seeing him in the flesh. That would involve all of us. He's talking about he does not in any way perceive who God is. If you're doing evil and call yourself a follower of God or a Christian, follower of God in the Old Testament or a Christian in the New, and you're doing evil, you don't know anything about God. If you're comfortable with doing evil, none of us are perfect. But he's in essence saying, if you're comfortable with doing evil, you're wicked. You're just wicked. And John says, don't follow that crowd. Now, John is very consistent, very blunt about how he sees things. For example, this is 3 John, and 1 John chapter 3, right underneath that. Verses 7 and 8. Little children, let no man deceive you. He that doeth righteousness is righteous, even as he is righteous. Before I go on, I just want to mention something to you here. He that doeth righteous is righteous. Don't misread that. It's not the doing righteousness that makes him righteous. It's faith that makes him righteous. We're justified by faith, Paul taught. But now that you're righteous, the fact that you have a right standing with God is demonstrated by your conduct. The righteous man does righteous things. That's what John is saying here. He that doeth righteousness is righteous. And then he goes on in verse 8 and said, he that committeth sin is of the devil. So I want you to see how simple everything is to him. In verse 11 of 3 John, he said, if somebody is doing good, they're from God. If somebody is doing evil, they don't know anything about God. In the first epistle, he said, if you're a righteous person, you're doing righteous things. If you're out committing sin, you're of the devil. Everything is just black and white to him. In 2 John, he talks about walking in the light and walking in the darkness. You're doing one or the other. You know, we love in America to talk about the gray area. John didn't know about the gray area. He said, you're either in the light or you're in the dark. Everything was either or. He liked these comparisons in his writings. You're either following God or you're following the devil. You're either doing right or you're doing wrong. You're either in the darkness or you're in the light. These things just were so simple to John. So, he said, what are you guys letting him get away with this for? You're following somebody who's doing evil. Stop it. Stop it. He said, I'm going to come, Lord willing, and I'm going to have a talk with that guy. Now, I'm going to tell you, I don't see myself, in my younger years, I didn't like any kind of conflict, and I still don't enjoy it. But if it came to me, I didn't like to initiate conflict. Somebody else initiated it, then the old blood boils a little bit and you're up for the fight. And John, here's the thing with John and Paul. These apostles, they understood that what they're writing is what the future church is going to live by. They didn't want anybody messing with it, anybody diluting it. Paul said in Galatians 1, if anyone preaches to you something that's different than what I preach to you, let God curse them. Wow. You think that's something? And then he said, if I come back to your town, he's writing to the Galatians, if I come back to your town and I preach to you something that I've already different than what I've already preached to you, let me be cursed. He's saying what you heard coming out of my mouth was the word of Almighty God, and that word must be protected. John certainly understood that as well. And so he thought, well, I'll come to town, I'll have a talk with him if I get there. We never know if we have no idea if he got there or not. So, John was, as you see there, was pretty direct in what he taught. You do good or you do evil. You do what's right or you sin. We could even carry it out farther. You walk in the light or walk in darkness. So, John was all, it's this or this, this or this. Christians have a tendency to want to excuse bad conduct, so they come up with something that doesn't exist in the Scripture. Gray area. Not a gray area. It's right or it's wrong. It's light or it's dark. It's good or it's evil. That's what John said. All right. So, verse 12, he's going to send somebody to see them. We don't know. He brings up a guy named Demetrius. And he has good things to say about him. Says he has good report of all men. In other words, he's not out there sinning his life away. He's got a good report of all men and of the truth itself. Yea, and we also bear record, and you know that our record is true. So the church he's writing to is familiar with John, not just by reputation evidently, but by experience. He says, you know what I say is true. And so, this Diotrephes, the bad guy, sets an example to be of a horde. Demetrius sets one to be imitated. We know of him as of Diotrephes. The only thing we know about either one of these guys is what this letter tells us here. Everything else is speculation. One speculation is this Demetrius in verse 12 might be the letter bearer. The one, when I was talking Wednesday night about Philemon, how the runaway slave had ended up in prison with Paul in Rome, and Paul led him to Christ. And now Paul was saying, do the right thing, go back to your owner. And so Paul writes this letter called Philemon that's in the Bible and tells him, when you receive him, don't receive him as a slave, receive him as a brother. And he gets out. Onesimus is the slave's name. He is released. And many believe he's the one that carried the letter of Philemon from Paul to Philemon. So he was the scribe. He's the one writing for Paul. Paul told him what to write, and he wrote it. And then he might have been the letter bearer, and he took that letter back to Philemon. This Demetrius might have been, it's somebody that John was very familiar with and very proud of, and he was the opposite of the other guy. He said, what are you listening to anything that guy has to say for? This guy, he said, Christians, he's a good report among the believers. And so this Demetrius there is a Demetrius who's a silversmith in Ephesus who got saved, but we have no way of knowing, once again, if they're the same guy. There's a lot of people with same names. Not every Dave on the planet is me. Not every Barb on the planet is her. She's the only one that matters, but they're not all her. So we have no way of knowing if the two Demetriuses are the same. But nonetheless, what we do know, Demetrius did the right thing, had a good example. So he's telling his readers, listen to what he tells you when he gets there. Listen to him. This man's of good report. In essence, he said in so many words, quit listening to the other guy. And the other guy is not a good guy. What are you following him for? Why do you think that happens, that people follow someone they know is just not the guy to follow? A lot of it is they just don't like conflict. He's got the power, they don't want to get kicked out of church. You know what would happen? This church might not be a good example of this, but if I kicked my wife out of church, it wouldn't. The only crushing thing to her would be, how dare my husband do that? And I would sleep in locked rooms for a really long time in fear. But nonetheless, she could go out there to block over and find a church to go to. In Council Bluffs, you kick someone out of church, not the end of the world. All they have to do is get in the car and drive somewhere else. When this man kicked people out of the church, there was no other church in town. So I'm sure that was some of the fear why people shut up and did what he told them to do. And so it was going to take somebody with authority to correct that and get that church back in shape. So, the last two verses, he ends it much the way he ended his second epistle. I have many things to write, but I will not with ink and pen write unto thee. But I trust I shall shortly see thee, and we shall speak face to face. Peace be to thee, our friends. Salute thee. Greet the friends of mine, the friends by name. So, he's in essence, and again, I said earlier, I can't imagine him writing that if he was still on Patmos, but if you've been delivered from boiling oil, I guess you could write that. I hope to see you soon, because you're ever believing God might deliver you from the island. Just really hard to say where he was at the time, but you get the appearance, or you get the feeling from 2nd and 3rd John that he was mobile. He was not on that island anymore.